The discovery of Richard III made news headlines around the world.
It was a result of a DNA comparison.
I did a little dance around the lab.
King Richard III was found buried under a parking lot.
The earthly remains of the last of the Plantagenet king.
But much of what happened behind the scenes has never been revealed.
If I'd put this trench in 50 centimetres further east, I'd have missed it entirely.
Our documentary team followed the whole process from the first trench to the final test.
You take the teeth and then you crush them. From that, you try and extract the DNA.
The only TV crew to observe the scientists at work. In this film, those involved tell the full story.
That's what I think would have delivered that wound to the top of the head.
With new revelations.
It's just possible that the hands of this individual were tied at the point he was buried.
And surprising twists.
Joe Appleby thought it could possibly be a female. It was almost like having to think about planning emigration at that stage.
This is the inside track on one of the greatest archaeological detective stories ever told. The hunt for England's lost king. Summer 2012. The search began for the remains of Richard III, the last English king to die in battle. The location? A car park in Leicester. Not the usual burial ground for a king, but our turbulent history holds an explanation. Richard was killed at Bosworth in 1485 in a battle for the crown. He's one of our most notorious monarchs. Tudor historians and later Shakespeare cemented his reputation as the archetypal villain.
I can smile and murder whilst I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions.
His body was taken to Greyfriars Church in Leicester, 14 miles away. He was buried quickly in a simple grave. The building was destroyed during the Reformation and the tomb was lost. There the story would have ended if it wasn't for Philippa Langley, a member of the Richard III Society, a group dedicated to rehabilitating his reputation.
It's really important that we get to the medieval level as soon as possible.
She joined forces with the archaeologists at Leicester University. Piecing together different maps of Leicester, they calculated the approximate location of the friary.
The old maps proved surprisingly accurate. The 18th century streets on the 18th century map and the modern streets all still lined up.
Philippa commissioned a radar survey of the site, but it proved inconclusive. The only way to find out if Richard was still there was to dig.
The idea of actually finding a named individual, especially Richard III, I thought was a very, very slim possibility.
That's it, just... It seemed utterly bonkers. One of the things you don't do in archaeology is you don't go looking for famous people.
I confess, I think we were all quite skeptical that we would actually find anything. I remember being there on the first day going, it'll be fine. We won't find anything, it'll be fine.
Don't go too deep.
Thinking there's some bones on top, there may be a skeleton. I was there to witness the whole thing.
Realistically, I thought we'd be doing well just to find a few friary buildings, dig those, do a bit of sample excavation, close it up, and off we'd go. But it became clear pretty soon that there was going to be more to this project than we originally thought.
In the first trench on the first day, site director Matt Morris made an intriguing find, but no one yet realised its significance.
I'd spotted a bit of bone sticking out, and that wasn't particularly surprising. We know it's a church in the area, we know it has a graveyard. Fortunately, I missed machining the skeleton's legs off.
What's that there, then?
Well, it's bone. I think it may be human bone.
So what have we got?
We found human bone. It looks to be two legs parallel with each other. And that, to me, suggests it's an articulated human burial rather than just loose bone knocking around in the soil. So now that we know it's articulated, we can't touch it until we get the Home Office licence to deal with the human remains.
Okay.
What we can do, though, is we can clean all the way around it, clear all the loose rubble back, and we'll then get a good idea whether we've got more burials in the area, if we can see any other features that may relate to a graveyard or to the friary. So it's good news. It's been a good first day.
Matt had no evidence that these remains had any connection to Richard. The challenge was still to find the friary, locate the church, and pinpoint the choir area where he was reputedly buried. Finds started coming thick and fast.
Window glass and architectural fragments like this really means that we're looking at a very high status site and almost certainly religious in nature.
The first two trenches rapidly revealed the location of the friary cloisters and the chapter house. The church had to be nearby, and there were clues in Trench 1.
A wall of this width, as you've suggested, is carrying some serious weight.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to know what sort of buildings within the friary it would be if it wasn't the church.
Yeah.
There was enough money for one more trench. They decided to dig on the north side. An inspired choice which gave me the chance to make my first archaeological finds. Very ornate.
We started finding lots of floor surfaces, lots of mortar floor surfaces. Instantly, great contender for the church. In fact, there's nothing else really it could have been.
In just over a week, the team had achieved more than they dared hope. The first two trenches held the friary cloisters and the chapter house. Trench 3 revealed the position of the church and more evidence. Richard, this is when we're on the other side in that trench. You said you wanted two things to be found on this side: the walls, the rubber walls going this way.
Yes.
And then hopefully something resembling a choir, which would mean that's where Richard might be buried. So, are we excited?
Very excited. I mean, what we were wanting was really to... We only had one wall there. We wanted two to make a building.
Yeah.
And then we've got an area of mortar floor between. So, yeah, that's exactly what we wanted.
What happened next caught me by surprise. The team realised that the church choir could extend all the way back to the first trench and to the leg bones found on the first day.
Suddenly the body became much more interesting. It meant it was a grave within the east end of the church, in the perfect position in the church to actually make it worth exhuming. Suddenly we'd gone from sort of doubting we'd ever find anything to having managed to put all the trenches exactly where we need them to answer everything we were looking for.
This is where Matt found the bones. Whoa, and they're going in. There's some pretty serious work going on there. The plan here is they're going to dig out another section of that wall there so that we can get at the bones. Are we worried about the bricks falling down onto it?
No, I've got it well padded and the skeleton isn't actually exposed yet, so the soil will protect it. So.
Leicester University bone expert Jo Appleby was called in to excavate the skeleton. She wore protective clothing, not to protect her, but to make sure her DNA didn't contaminate the bones she was about to investigate. Here we've discovered something to go with our legs.
Yeah, Joe's just found a skull in the grave.
Oh, wow.
It's a bit of a problem though, in that it seems to be a lot higher than where we had the legs
Right,
when we
I
found
see.
them.
I'm quite excited because that appears to be a hole in the skull.
Yes, that's not an old hole. That's a hole that's been there for 10 minutes. Where I was just basically taking it down with this mattock here, and unfortunately that's gone into the top of the skull, so that's what's caused that hole.
Right.
I excavated the legs, they seemed to be normal. I exposed the arms. Again, there was no sign that anything out of the ordinary was occurring. Until I started to excavate the spinal column. The first few vertebrae were completely normal, were doing exactly what I expected. But when I got to about the fifth vertebra from the bottom, all of a sudden, the next one wasn't where I was expecting it to be, and I couldn't find it. I then actually spent a little bit of time excavating the area around it to try to figure out what had happened, and I found the next vertebra was displaced considerably off to one side. That was something that made me aware that we might be dealing with something out of the ordinary, because one thing that we know about Richard III is that he's reported to have a crooked back. The feeling of that point was really one of mounting disbelief. I absolutely wasn't expecting to find the skeleton of Richard III.
Finding the bones was very fortunate. As Matt admitted, it almost never happened.
We were pretty blind when we came to cut the trenches, just to show how improbable the task of finding him was. If I'd put this trench in 50 centimetres further east, I'd have missed it entirely and we'd have never known he was there. Once I realised how close I'd come to missing him, it was sort of, phew.
A close shave, but the king had been uncovered. Next, this medieval skeleton was about to embark on another journey into the realm of 21st century science. September 2012. The archaeologists from Leicester University were gathered around a hole in the ground containing a lost King of England. And they didn't quite know how to react.
Yes, the cool thing for me to say in terms of looking at the burial would be to say, oh yes, it's another burial, how interesting, and all that sort of thing. But actually, I mean, for me, because it became humanised by the fact that this was potentially the burial we were looking for, and we can put a name to him, and we've seen portraits of him, and we knew what he did, and the fact that he died in battle, it was actually a very poignant moment in many respects. So I think, yes, I would be lying if I didn't say that the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I looked down this hole and saw the curved spine and saw the skull with evidence of trauma on it. So it was quite a moment, really, yeah.
You suddenly thought, hang on a minute. Trauma to the head, east end of the church in the choir, curved spine. Have we actually managed to do this? Femur.
Yeah, left femur.
The spine was the last thing to be lifted. We needed to treat it with a lot of care, because this was obviously going to be something that was going to need to be intact and carefully looked at in the lab.
The skeleton had been uncovered only a few hours, but already Joe was able to piece together part of the extraordinary story these bones can tell. It was clear the body had been dumped in the ground more in haste than respect.
The body had been slightly squashed up within the grave, so that the head was actually quite pushed up against the end of it. And something that was quite interesting is that the position of the hands is slightly strange for a medieval burial. They were crossed over the pelvis, but slightly over to one side. It's just possible that this might indicate that the hands of this individual were tied at the point that he was buried.
Cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up. and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them.
This individual was placed into a very simply constructed grave. We don't have evidence for any kind of elaboration in it. We don't have a coffin, for example, or any other kinds of grave fittings. So he must have gone in either as he was or possibly in a shroud, but nothing of that has remained if that was the case.
The lack of grave goods made the archaeologist's job much harder. There were no tombstones, no inscriptions, no keepsakes. The only way to prove the skeleton's identity lay in the bones themselves.
As we drove away, although the bulk of the skeleton was in the box in the back, Jo actually had the skull on her lap. The skull was the one we were going to take DNA from, and we'd kept it separate because we had to get it into the fridge. It was all carefully wrapped up, and we couldn't just risk rolling around in the van, so she was carefully holding on to it as we drove away. That was the surreal thing.
This box of bones was about to create a huge fuss. The team at Leicester made their first announcement. This could be Richard.
We have a man with what appear to be battle injuries who suffered from severe scoliosis, that is curvature of the spine, respectfully but modestly buried in a place of honour in a friary church.
Clearly, we are all very excited by these latest discoveries. This is potentially a historic moment for the university and the city of Leicester.
But behind the scenes, the team had a vast amount of work to do. There would be CT scans, carbon dating, DNA sequencing, facial reconstruction, skeletal analysis. Every single piece of evidence had to support their case.
It's quite a responsibility. I'm at a fairly early stage in my career. If something goes wrong with this, it's going to be very, very damaging for me. So yes, it does stress me a little bit.
All would come to nothing if the scientists could not prove it was Richard. Geneticist Turi King had one of the toughest jobs. She had to find fragile DNA in bones that were 500 years old.
Actually, what you could do is if you just hold it in place.
When you're working with ancient remains, you have to be extremely careful about contamination. One of the biggest issues with ancient DNA is contamination with modern DNA. So what I was ensuring was that while excavating and while lifting the skelly, Jo was working under extremely clean conditions. When we were looking at the skelly, we were fully garbed up in the suits. We had face masks, we were double gloved.
To ensure an accurate DNA result, each step had to be double-checked at 2 separate labs.
The skeletal remains were actually in extremely good condition. Now, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll be able to get ancient DNA out of them because it completely depends on the soil conditions. And what I was hoping to get were teeth, and that's because they're the most likely bit to remain. They're usually very well preserved. So what you do is you take the teeth and you take them into a clean room, you clean them extremely carefully, and then you crush them into a powder. And then from that, you try and extract the DNA from that powder.
Sounds simple, but ancient DNA is broken into thousands of tiny fragments. Piecing them together takes months of painstaking work. Meanwhile, Jo Appleby took charge of the bones, still covered in mud. She had to examine each bone in minute detail, searching for clues about this person's identity.
We're going to take a CT scan of the skeleton. The idea of that is that it will give us a good 3D record of it, and it will enable us to look in more detail at the nature of the trauma on it, and also potentially at the abnormality of the spine.
Help was at hand at the city hospital, who were about to receive a very unusual patient.
Obviously, a hospital scanner is used mostly for hospital patients. We're being allowed to use it in the evening because at that point it's usually free, but when we tried to do this earlier, there was a major accident and they needed to use it for patients, so we had to step back, and that's well and good and exactly as it should be. We took several of the molars out for the ancient DNA analysis, and removing those was absolutely terrifying. Sort of sitting there for about 3 hours, just gently wiggling the teeth, hoping that nothing was going to get broken.
There are 206 bones in the human body. Each one had to be positioned precisely.
The shape of the vertebrae changes as it goes down the spine, and one of the problems with this is, of course, the vertebrae are not completely normal.
Scanning the bones, mud and all, was a chance to make a complete record of the skeleton, just in case it fell apart during cleaning.
We've never scanned a skeleton like this before, and it's certainly a different thing to be thinking that it could be royalty.
But it wasn't all going according to plan. As Joe examined the skeleton, some data was about to throw everything into question. There was an outside chance this could be a woman.
There are some features on the pelvis rather wider than we would normally expect to see in a male skeleton.
The skeleton of Richard III was beginning to reveal its secrets. The CT scans were already being used by Dr. Caroline Wilkinson at Dundee University to reconstruct his face.
This model has been made by putting all the layers of the CT scans together and forming a 3D model. The process that we use for the reconstruction and depiction is anatomical. So what it should give us is a scientific evaluation of the face from this skull rather than the artistic representation in the portrait.
A well-known painting of Richard survives. It would be interesting to see if the reconstructed face resembled it. But Caroline's technique was based on scientific data about muscle thickness and the distance between skin and skull.
We've got a set of tissue depths measurements that are taken from white European men, in this case between the ages of 30 and 40. So we get lots of little virtual pegs so that it gives a kind of contour map within which we can work to produce the depiction. And basically slowly build the face from the skull out to the muscle structure.
In Leicester, with the CT scans complete, the skeleton could at last be carefully cleaned. Then Jo started her analysis.
I'll carry out a more detailed assessment of the age of the skeleton. I'll record in more detail the characteristics that enable us to determine sex, although you can see that by observing it in the field. I will also take a series of measurements.
Jo's measurements revealed that this individual would have stood 5 feet 8 inches tall and died sometime in the late 20s or early 30s. Richard was 32 when he died. But most intriguing of all was the spinal deformity. To define and classify the spine's distinct curve, the team called in Dr. Piers Mitchell, a leading expert in spinal deformities.
Scoliosis is a 3D twisting of the spine that gives the appearance of an S-shaped curve to the spine. When we look at the skeleton, we can see that this individual had a very distinct scoliosis. Taking measurements from the photographs when he was in the ground show the curve was between 60 and 80 degrees, which is a pretty big curve.
Piers joined me, Jo and Philippa Langley from the Richard III Society to cast his expert eye over the bones.
We've got the skeleton here laid out, and we've reproduced the curve as best we can. Just to show you a little bit about some of the bones we've got here. On this vertebra, you can see how we've got bone formed in the ligaments that connect this vertebra with the one above, which showed the curve would have been pretty stiff.
Incredibly, peers could tell that this scoliosis was not present at birth.
Looking at Richard's bones, we can see that they're all of a roughly normal shape, so he didn't have a congenital scoliosis. Now, we know that his scoliosis started before he finished growth because we can actually see subtle changes on the bones where they follow the line of the curve, so they become very subtly wedge-shaped. So it's likely that his scoliosis started somewhere between the age of perhaps 10 and 13, roughly when most boys start going through their pubertal growth spurt.
Inwardly, the effect was startling. The effect externally can be seen in this photograph of a modern patient with the condition. The scoliosis would have affected Richard's height too. He would have been shorter than the initial estimate of 5 feet 8 inches. The scoliosis could also have put immense strain on his heart and lungs and may have caused severe pain. Back to the sort of the Shakespearean myth. Would he have had a withered arm or any sort of oddness in his arms?
If you compare humerus on one side with a humerus on the other, they're exactly the same length. Same for the forearm, they're symmetric on both sides, so there's no reason to think that one side was withered compared with the other. One thing Joe and I did notice was that the radius bones here are relatively gracile or feminine. When we looked at the bones, especially the bones of his arms, there weren't strong muscle attachment markings, and the bones look quite slim. He must have been physically less chunky, perhaps, than someone who is going to have robust, strong muscle markings on their bones.
There are also some features on the pelvis. This feature here, the sciatic notches here are wider than we would normally expect to see in a male skeleton. This is a feature that varies. You can have a feminine sciatic notch and be male.
Wow. Gender shocker in lab.
There were, yes, a number of highs and a number of lows, and I think probably the most scary one was really when Joe Appleby was initially looking at the skeleton and sent me an email saying she thought it could possibly be a female, and I just couldn't believe that as a possibility. It was almost like having to think about planning emigration at that stage.
However, historical texts from the period suggested that Richard did have a quite feminine physique, as Professor Lynn Foxall explains.
It's a very interesting description, this one, because using those particular words, slight in body and weak in strength. Now, that Latin word strength is a really interesting one, vis. Vis as a concept often carries overtones of masculinity with it. It's not a concept that's regularly applied, for example, to women. The very delicate, gracile skeleton that we have, that itself is something that maybe even prompts the descriptions that we find in the texts.
For absolute proof of the skeleton's sex, the DNA test had to show a male Y chromosome. And to confirm its identity, the team needed a DNA match with a living relative. Finding that living relative would be critical. It all depended on a type of DNA passed down exclusively through the female line, mitochondrial DNA.
If there's anything that's left in terms of DNA coming out of the skeletal remains, we expect it to be mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA is in the egg, so a woman will pass it down to all of her children, male and female, but only daughters will pass it on.
So the search was on for a descendant of Richard III's family who shared this particular DNA. One man, historian John Ashdown Hill, had set out to find one.
I knew immediately that it was going to be a difficult task.
John focused on the female line.
Richard III's mother, Cecily Neville, had a number of sisters, and I had to follow all their lines. It was promising, strangely, down to the 19th century. But suddenly I got to a stage where they were all not marrying, or marrying very late and having no children, or marrying very late and having only one child and it turned out to be a son. And all this mass of evidence was all of a sudden disappearing. Eventually, I did find just one line that preserved this all-female line to the present day.
That royal relative turned out to be a woman called Joyce Ibsen, who lived in Canada. Joyce died, but her son Michael inherited her mitochondrial DNA, and we found him working as a cabinet maker in North London. If DNA from the skeleton matched Michael's, that was the proof the team needed that the skeleton was indeed Richard.
Hi. I'm looking for nephew of Richard III. Have I found him?
I think you found one.
The last of the Plantagenets.
Well,
possibly.
Possibly.
Did you ever feel you had this royal blood?
No, we had no idea until my mother was contacted in 2005 by John Ashdown Hill and informed that he had traced her as a female line descendant of Anne of York, Richard's elder sister. All this business of DNA, well, DNA is physically, it's part of who you are. Part of my physical being is directly related to the family of Richard III. And that's, it makes you stop and think. And I find it somewhat overwhelming at times.
Research by Leicester University's genealogist, Professor Kevin Schurer, confirmed Michael was a direct descendant, 17 generations removed from Richard. He was related through the all-important female line. But the line stops with Michael and his siblings. When they die, the line dies with them. So the skeleton was unearthed in the nick of time. In Leicester, Michael met with project geneticist Dr. Churi King.
That's fantastic. There should be plenty. Great stuff. Right, well, what I've got here is I have got a spit sample from Michael Ibsen, and that contains an awful lot of his DNA. It's got a lot of his cheek cells in there. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking some of this and extracting his DNA from it, and then I'm going to be sequencing his mitochondrial DNA and comparing it with any mitochondrial DNA we can get from the skeletal remains.
Unlike the skeleton, Michael's DNA took Churi a matter of days to analyze and sequence because it was in so much better condition.
So this is essentially part of the sequence of Michael's mitochondrial DNA. And this is actually from my dad. And what you'll see is that not everybody has got the same DNA sequence. You can see that there's difference between the two of them. So my dad here has got a particular sequence and Michael has got a slightly different one. So that's how you can tell mitochondrial DNA sequences apart from one another. And what I'll be doing is trying to get the DNA sequence from the same region in the skeletal remains and then comparing the two sequences. And what we're hoping is that we'll get a perfect match.
As the DNA hunt intensified, the team were making astonishing discoveries on the skeleton, revealing not just how Richard died, but the sequence of injuries, the weapons that caused them, and his final brutal and bloody moments as he fought for his crown and life on the battlefield.
That's the blow, what did it, probably.
5 months after breaking tarmac, the scientists were close to declaring that our skeleton was Richard III. A medieval grave in a sacred place, a curved spine, the right age at death. A living female line relative of Richard III had been found, and his DNA was being compared to the skeleton. Meanwhile, another test was underway that would add an important piece to the jigsaw.
Well, carbon dating's been around since about the 1940s, and it's a scientific method of dating living organisms. And so it relies on the fact that all living organisms absorb a certain amount of a radioactive isotope called carbon-14, and which on the death of the organism, it decays at a known rate, which then means you can produce a date.
The technique involved taking a sample from the skeleton and isolating its constituent elements. This would reveal how old the bones were and give clues about the person's diet. Philippa, John and I were there for the result. We hoped it would be close to the year of Richard's death, 1485.
We had sort of hopes that we'd get within 80 years, was the thing, so we could eliminate any of this sort of earlier medieval burials. And the initial dates have come in, and they're suggesting sort of 1430 to 60. which is a bit on the early side. When we first got the dates coming in, and I saw in the initial paragraphs that it said 1430 to 60, I did think, oh no, it's a bit too early, really. But then as you read further down the page, the radiocarbon specialist said that you had to apply a correction because this individual had a high marine diet, i.e. they were eating lots of fish, and this would then have an effect on the dating process. Because the individual was eating a lot of marine fish, by eating marine fish, the marine fish are absorbing lots of earlier carbon-14 and it's distorting the date. So then it's remodelled. It then gives us a 95.4% probability that it's AD 1450 to 1540.
It is.
That's great. So I think what's particularly interesting about this analysis is that it's confirmed that Richard III had a very high protein diet. Lots of meat and even more fish, which is effectively showing us what a high status individual he was. Because the population of medieval Leicester, based on work we've done on many excavations in the city, show that most people would have been eating pottage, and only very rarely would they be able to get access to fresh meat and fish.
Back in Dundee, Caroline was making progress with the facial reconstruction.
Now I'm just adding some skin over and above the muscle structure.
With the skin added, she started to see a likeness.
He's looking like Richard III. It's kind of scary, actually, because for it to look so similar makes me doubt the objectivity of what we've done. So, which means I've had to go back and check everything a million times to make sure that this is following anatomical standards, which it is, and it's coming out to look very similar to the face that we see in the portraits, which is great.
The next stage was to make a 3D model complete with skin, texture and hair.
It's probably not going to become that clear until we've added those textures, because it's, at the moment he looks like a clay head rather than a person.
This is really nice, isn't it? The detail that you can see on here is fantastic.
In Leicester, another investigation was underway. Materials engineer Sarah Hainsworth and weapons expert Bob Woosnam Savage were matching the skeletal injuries to the weapons that might have caused them.
One direction, it looks a bit like a scoop.
Yes, definitely. There's the blade coming across.
This is really interesting, this injury here to the top of the head. We've clearly still got bone in the gap between the two bits of the skull there. It's just been sufficient to break the skull, but not to puncture right through and push that plug of bone out of the way.
When we analysed the skeleton, we were able to identify a number of injuries on it. Interestingly, none of them showed any signs of healing, so that we know that they all occurred around the time of death.
Joe Appleby, forensic pathologist Stuart Hamilton and armourer Bob Woosnam Savage identified a pattern to the fatal blows.
We found a series of injuries on the skeleton tell us about the moments leading up to his death and immediately afterwards. You can see that there's a bit of a slice here, and we think that what's happened there is perhaps somebody has taken a slicing action at him with a sharp-bladed weapon, and it's just nicked the top of the head.
Yes, the blade is sort of a scooping depression, and there's still striations on there, so the blade came in and out.
Bob believed this injury was probably caused by a sword. Not a blunt, cumbersome weapon, but a piece of advanced military technology.
These were actually state-of-the-art weapons at the time, and this fine medieval sword is actually nothing more than a precision instrument, a killing machine or the same, but it's perfectly balanced to do its job. That's its point of balance, and that means this sword could be used with great speed, great grace, great dexterity, but it's there to kill somebody.
So then we also have this much more noticeable but still quite small wound. It's a penetrating injury of some kind. You can see there's just a very small entrance wound on the top of the skull.
The penetrating wound to the top of the head was probably delivered by something like this. This is known as a rondel dagger, The blade, as you can see, is actually a four-sided needle, a very strong needle, and it's designed purely for piercing. And you find in the late 15th century illustrations which show people holding a dagger like this over a prone victim. They're standing over his head and they are pushing down on the top pommel. That's what I think would have delivered that wound to the top of the head.
And then, of course, we come to the most obvious of the wounds on the skull, which is this very major slice that's been taken off. And we actually have part of the slice of bone that's been cut away here.
It's a very, very dramatic injury. Again, you're talking about a lot of force behind something to actually cut through the skull like this. But certainly, if you look at where this injury is, the brain would be visible through that. We all know how vascular the scalp is. We know how many blood vessels are. You just bump your head and how much it bleeds. There's these areas where pieces of scalp will be sliced off for the skull. So there's going to be a lot of blood coming from those injuries. There is going to be brain visible. You don't walk away from something like that.
No.
Not even today with modern neurosurgery.
So I think that's the blow what did it, probably. This is a halberd. This is basically an axe blade, as you can see. Now, these would have been razor sharp, these edges, and what's interesting about the halberd being used is that this would seem to match the catastrophic trauma on the back of the skull there, where it's been sliced. I think this is the killing weapon.
So then there's one final wound on the skeleton, and again, we're very sure that this is something that happened after the death of Richard, and that's on the pelvis. There's actually a line across here. We can see that something's come in from the back. It's penetrated slightly to the front there. So what we think is that somebody has actually stabbed him with some kind of a bladed weapon.
Into the buttocks?
Yeah, into the backside.
In total, there were 10 identifiable injuries. The small stabbing wound to the top of his skull, 3 more glancing blows, a dagger to the cheekbone, a cut to the jaw, 2 fatal wounds to the base of the skull, a blade cut to the ribs, and a brutal humiliation wound, probably administered after death. He may have suffered countless further injuries that left no mark on his skeleton.
The combination of the curvature of the spine and the pattern of injuries, it's not just the single injury that caused death, but the pattern of the injuries suggests very strongly that this is him. Overall, we have a series of things which are quite unlikely in themselves, and they've all come together, and the chances of that happening and it not being him are actually relatively small.
One final piece of proof was needed, a DNA match. With the media gathering for the announcement, Churi gave us the answer.
I genuinely don't know what the DNA result is. Michael, thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. So,
if you look at the DNA of Michael and you look at the DNA from the skeletal remains, there's a match.
Wow.
Blimey!
Wow. Looking at the sequences, the match was identical. Richard and Michael share one of the rarest types of mitochondrial DNA called haplotype J1C2C. It's carried by just 1 to 2% of the population. This made the match even more reliable.
So I started to see the first sequences come back and seeing that it was a match, and I just went really quiet. It was very profound.
Churi also revealed that she had managed to isolate a Y chromosome, proving that the skeleton was male.
What was so exciting about the moment of being told was it meant that we could actually say beyond reasonable doubt that we'd found Richard III. Whereas without the DNA, it might have been something like the balance of probability is that it's Richard III.
To reinforce the genealogical research, Kevin Shura and Churi King obtained a DNA sample from another female line relative of Richard III. They also matched.
And I can now tell you
There is a DNA match between the maternal DNA from the descendants of the family of Richard III and the skeletal remains that we found at the Greyfriars Dig.
Richard's skeleton is now undergoing further scientific tests to tell us more about his life. Churi King is analysing his DNA in even greater detail, investigating his Y chromosome to check the male line of descent, and searching for evidence of hereditary disease. The skeleton has more secrets to reveal.
Oh, it's been incredibly surreal. It makes me think the time was right, and do you know, it makes me think it was meant to be.
This was such a long shot, and none of us ever expected to find a dead king. I mean, come on, how often do archaeologists do this?
The facial reconstruction bears a remarkable likeness to the portrait. The face of Richard III. For everyone involved, it's been an incredible journey. After all, it's not very often you come across the remains of a king in a car park.